In this segment, we're going to talk about the two primary types of preaching. Now, the reality is there's actually more than two. There are various types of sermons and teachings that exist within our contemporary church context. However, I think the majority of sermons out there typically fall into one of two buckets, and that is topical sermons and expository sermons. Topical sermons, in essence, are exactly that. They're about a particular topic. This is where the preacher has a predetermined idea or topic that he would like to communicate for the audience. In expository preaching, however, you don't come to the table with a topic predetermined. Instead, you are taking a particular text, a particular passage of Scripture, and you are exposing what that passage is teaching about. Now, many times, expository sermons sort of dovetail or evolve into topical sermons. But in essence, you're taking the topic from a passage of Scripture. You are pulling it out, and all of your subpoints and all of your lessons that drive home the overarching topic come from that passage. That is, in essence, what an expository sermon is. And some sermons are very topical in that there is a topic and simply just some ideas with some passages of Scripture built into them. And some sermons are more expositional or more expository than others. And sometimes you have preachers that are kind of somewhere in between. I remember I preached at a retreat not too long ago, and I was expositing from a passage of Scripture, Luke 15. And I remember afterwards, a friend of mine that was in the audience came up to me and said, "Hey, there's a guy in the audience who said, I thought Kenny really loved expository preaching." And my friend said, "Yeah, that was an expository sermon you just heard." The guy he was dialoguing with said, "Well, that actually was enjoyable to listen to. Most expository sermons I listen to are kind of boring. It's just sort of a bunch of information about the text. It's sort of a lecture." And the reality is that so frequently, expository preaching can become nothing more than a verbal commentary. You're just reading the passage and just sort of talking about it. That's an academic lecture. That's not a sermon. So we want to be careful that even in our expository preaching, that we don't necessarily feel the need to abandon the idea of making an impact. So frequently, we approach expository preaching in a manner that is, quite frankly, a little bit boring or a little bit overly scholastic, shall I say, kind of nerdy. And in that case, it's not very impactful. This is why so many people go into topical preaching. They feel like they can make an impact in a grander fashion. And I would concede that being an impact preacher is easier with topical sermons. But I would also argue that being an impact preacher is actually more long-lasting if you do it through expository sermons. It's easier to be an impact preacher through topical sermons. It's more long-lasting if you're an impact preacher through expository sermons. In this particular video series, we're going to talk mostly about how to be a great expository preacher. I'm going to focus primarily on how to develop sermons through the exposing or the exposition of specific types of passages of Scripture. And quite frankly, this should apply to all forms of preaching. Even in topical sermons, you should be taking bits of passages of Scripture and exposing what we see in those. It's not exactly a black and white type of deal. Sometimes your sermons seem a little bit fuzzy. Is it more topical? Is it more expository? Sometimes you'll dovetail into one genre more than the other. But I think in general, the most effective way to preach is to not come to the sermon with an idea already in mind, but coming to a particular text, a particular passage, and asking the question, what is the topic or the truth that is in this text? And simply highlight that or expose that for your audience. Sometimes you'll find yourself preaching more topically. Other times you'll find yourself preaching in a more expository fashion. But regardless of which of these two you prefer, I believe that all sermons should have huge chunks of expositing involved in the content. Even the topical sermons should involve some elements of exegesis, and that is exposing or highlighting the things we see in the Scriptures. I happen to prefer expository preaching, and in the next segment, I'm going to make the case as to why expository preaching actually is the ideal way to preach.